The water was already hot. It had to be hot. Not warm, not comfortable, hot enough that my own hands went red pulling the kettle off the stove. I carried the basin out to the porch and set it on the low bench my grandfather built, and I laid the towel beside it, folded in three, the way my mother folded it, the way her mother folded it. Then I stood in the doorway with my apron still damp from the wash, and I waited, because I could hear the gate, and I knew I had about 90 seconds before he came around the corner of the barn, and every single one of those 90 seconds already had a job. I was 19 the first time I did it. I was 31 the last time. And in all the years between, not one person ever told me to. Before I tell you what happened when he came around that corner, and what I did every evening for 11 years without ever once being instructed to do it out loud, let me introduce myself. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I left. And this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where we say the things we were never allowed to say out loud. If you want the truth about plain life from someone who actually lived inside it, not the tourist version, not the postcard version, subscribe and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments, what do you think an Amish wife is expected to do when her husband walks in from the field? I want to see how close you get. Because I promise you, it is both more ordinary and more strange than you are imagining right now. Now let me explain what you just heard, because I know how it sounds. Here is what people outside the community do not understand about Amish marriage. There is no list. There is no manual. Nobody sits a bride down and hands her the evening and says, "This is yours to manage." And yet every wife in my church district did nearly the same things, in nearly the same order, at nearly the same hour, and not one of us had ever discussed it with another living soul. That is what the ordnung is. Our unwritten code. It governs the color of your dress, and the width of a man's hat brim, and whether your buggy may have a windshield. But the part nobody writes about, the part I am going to tell you about tonight, is that the ordnung also governs the shape of an evening. It governs a woman's hands from the moment she hears the gate. Let me give you the official version first, the version they would give you if you knocked on the door. A wife keeps a peaceful home. A wife has supper ready. A wife is a helpmeet. That is the language. Gelassenheit, yielding, submission, the letting go of your own will. It was the highest virtue we had. And I want to be honest with you. It is a beautiful word. It is also a cage. And I did not understand that both of those things could be true at once until I was almost 30 years old. Now let me tell you what actually happens. He came in from the fields at 6, in summer closer to 8, because you cut hay while the light holds. And the first thing, the very first thing before a single word is spoken between you, is the water, because he does not walk into my kitchen with the field still on him. That is the rule that is not a rule. The dirt of the field stays on the porch. So he sits down on that bench, and he pulls his boots off, and I kneel. I want you to hear that clearly. I knelt, not in prayer, not in ceremony. I knelt down on the boards of my own porch, in front of my own husband, and I took his feet in my hands, cracked, blistered, hot from 12 hours inside leather, and I put them in the water I had deliberately made too hot, because he liked it that way, and I washed them. Every evening, 11 years. Nobody ever told me to do this. Let me say that again, because it took me the longest to understand, and it is the thing I most want you to sit with. Not one person in my entire life, not my mother, not my bishop, not my husband, ever once said the words, "Martha, you will wash his feet." I simply watched my mother do it, and she had watched hers. By the time I was 7 years old, I had seen it 2,000 times, and it had gone into me the way a river goes into a stone. Slowly, completely, without either of them noticing. There is scripture in it, of course. There is always scripture in it. Foot washing is a real ordinance in our church. Twice a year, at communion, the men wash the men, and the women wash the women. And it is genuinely beautiful. And it means humility. And it means service. And it means we are all equal before God. That is the public version. That is the version performed in the barn, in front of 100 witnesses, in the light. The private version is a woman on her knees on a porch at dusk with nobody watching. And nobody calls that an ordinance. Nobody calls it anything at all. It has no name in our language. And that, I have come to believe, is exactly how I know it mattered. Then comes the shirt. He would peel it off stiff with salt and hand it to me without looking. And I would take it. And it would go into the basin and I would wring it and it would go on the line, because it had to be dry by morning. Then cool water from the porch pitcher over his hands, his forearms, the back of his neck, then the towel, folded in 3, then supper. And here is the part I truly need you to understand. I did not sit until he sat. I did not eat until he had food on his plate. And through the entire meal, my body was not really at that table. It was hovering, watching his glass, watching his plate, reading his shoulders. Because a wife who is doing this properly does not wait to be asked for anything. Being asked is a failure. Being asked means you did not see it coming. Do you understand what that does to a person over 11 years? Do you understand what it does to a woman's nervous system to spend every evening of her adult life reading a man's shoulders for a request that has not been made yet? I did not know I was doing it. That is the thing. I thought that was simply what a mind was. I thought everyone's mind sat slightly outside their own body, at an angle, watching. It took an English therapist to tell me there is a word for that. She used the word hypervigilance, and I laughed at her, because in my head I could hear my grandmother's voice saying, "That is not a disorder, child. That is a good wife." There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform. Not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now, let me tell you about my sister-in-law Rebecca, because this is where it stops being only my story. Rebecca married into our family when I was 24. She came from a different district, a little more conservative, up near the Schwarzentruber settlements, and she arrived with a nervousness in her that I recognized instantly without being able to name. One evening, early on, her husband came in from the field and she was still at the stove. The water was not out, the towel was not folded, and she turned around with flour on her hands and said, quite cheerfully, quite innocently, "There is a pitcher on the porch, help yourself." And the whole kitchen changed temperature. Nothing happened. Nobody shouted. Nobody struck anybody. That is not what this is, and I need you to hear that. Her husband simply walked out to the porch and washed his own hands, and came back in and sat down, and said grace, and ate his supper. And the entire evening proceeded in a silence that had weight to it, a silence you could have leaned against. And later, my mother-in-law took Rebecca aside, not angry, not unkind, genuinely warm. That is the terrible part. That is the part I need you to understand. And she said only this: the water should be waiting. 5 words. That is the whole education. That is the entire transmission of a rule that would govern the next 40 years of that woman's life. No explanation. No reason given. No scripture cited. Just, the water should be waiting. Rebecca cried in my pantry about it the following week. I remember standing there with my hands buried in bread dough, and I remember exactly what I said to her, and it shames me to this day. I said, "It is easier once it becomes a habit." I did not tell her it was wrong, because I did not know it was wrong. I did not have the vocabulary. I handed her the cage, and I called it a comfort, because that is precisely what had been handed to me. That is how it survives. Not through cruelty, through kindness, through one tired woman helping another tired woman carry a thing neither of them ever agreed to carry. Now I want to be very careful here, because I know what this sounds like from the outside, and I will not let you walk away with the wrong picture. My husband was not a cruel man. I need you to hear that. He was not a tyrant. He never raised his hand to me. He never raised his voice to me. And if you had sat him down and asked him honestly, he would have told you with complete sincerity that his wife was the finest woman in the county, and that he thanked God for her every day of his life. And he would have meant every word. He also did not know that I was tired. He did not know I had been awake since 4. He did not know that by the time he lowered himself into that chair, I had already made 11 separate decisions about his evening that he never learned existed. Because the entire design of the thing is that he never learns it exists. That is not a man being wicked. That is a man being made blind to a labor that was engineered to be invisible, which is precisely what the system was built to produce. He was not the one who failed me. The silence failed me. And the silence failed him too, because there was a whole woman standing 3 feet away from him for 11 years, and he was never once given the tools to see her. And there were good evenings. I will not sit here and pretend otherwise. There were evenings he came in from the field with a bird's nest in his hat, because he had found it in the fence line and thought I would want to see it. There were evenings we laughed so hard at that table that the children stopped chewing and stared at us. There were winter nights when the wind came off the fields, and he would press his freezing hands against the back of my neck just to make me shriek, and I would swat at him with a dish towel, and for one moment there was no ordnung in that room at all. There were only 2 people in a warm kitchen. Both things are true. That is the hardest sentence I have ever learned to say out loud. Both things are true. And then came one evening. An ordinary evening. No crisis, no argument, nothing at all. I was kneeling on that porch with his foot in my hands, and I looked down at my own arms in the low light, and I thought, I do not remember choosing this. Not the man. I chose the man. I do not regret the man. I mean the kneeling. I searched for the moment I had agreed to it. Right there, on the porch, with the water going cold in the basin, I went back through my whole life looking for it. And there was no moment, there was no day, there was no conversation, no vow, no ceremony, no consent. It had simply been poured into me, one drop at a time, from the age of 4, until the shape of me was the shape of the thing. That is what I need you to understand about how this actually works. Nobody ever gave the order. And a thing that was never ordered can never be refused, because there is nothing there to refuse. You cannot argue with a rule that does not exist. You cannot appeal a sentence that nobody ever handed down. My therapist, years later, said something I have not stopped turning over since. She said, "The most effective rules are the ones that were never spoken, because a spoken rule can be broken. An unspoken one becomes your personality." I was 31 when I left. The cost was immediate, and it was total. Meidung. The shunning. My letters returned unopened. My mother's silence on a borrowed telephone, the one time I tried. My father's table, where I am no longer permitted to sit. 9 years now, and my sister has not spoken my name aloud. I do not tell you that for pity. I tell you so you understand the price of the sentence I am about to say. The Amish world gave me things I will carry until the day I die. A community so deep it has a texture. For every barn raising, every funeral, every fire, they come. A work ethic that has carried me through every hard year on the outside. A faith that is complicated now, and wounded, and rebuilt, but real. I am not here to burn that down. Those are still my people. They will always be my people. But there is no scripture that requires a woman to spend 11 years hovering 3 inches outside of her own body. There is no theology that makes a wife's exhaustion holy. There is no God that I believe in now who would design a woman and then ask her to vanish quietly into someone else's evening, and call that obedience. I did not mind the water. I want to be exact with you, because this matters more than anything else I have said tonight. I did not mind the water. I would have carried that basin gladly. What I minded was that I was never asked. What I minded was that in 11 years of kneeling on those boards, not one person, not my husband, not my mother, not my church, not one soul in that entire valley, ever once said to me, "Martha, do you want to?" That question would have cost nothing. That question was free. And it was never asked. Not because anyone was cruel, but because in the world that made me, it was not a question that existed. So I am asking it now. Of you. If you grew up in a house where your service was assumed instead of requested, I see you. If you learned to read a room before you ever learned to read your own body, I see you. If you were called good and generous and selfless, and it took you 30 years to notice that every one of those words described something you did for other people, and not a single one of them described you, I see you. You are not a bad woman for wanting to be asked. You are not proud, you are not selfish, you are a person. And being a person was never something you needed to apologize for. Tell me in the comments what part of this stayed with you. Tell me if there was ever water in your house that was simply expected to be waiting. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the ordnung they never wrote down, first comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.